In the autumn of 1944, the Second World War had reached a turning point. Across Europe, the thunder of artillery and the constant rumble of tanks signaled that the conflict had entered its most decisive phase. The German war machine, which only a few years earlier had seemed unstoppable, was now under enormous pressure from every direction. Allied forces had landed in France during the summer, pushing steadily toward Germany's borders, while in the east, the Soviet army was advancing relentlessly. Battles were raging across continents, from the forests of Europe to the deserts of North Africa. Yet thousands of miles away, in the quiet towns and industrial centers of the United States, another part of the war was unfolding, one that few Americans had expected. By 1944, the Allies had captured vast numbers of German soldiers. Entire divisions had surrendered after being surrounded, cut off from supplies, or overwhelmed by superior Allied numbers and firepower. In North Africa, German and Italian forces had already suffered a massive defeat the year before, when the last Axis troops surrendered in Tunisia. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers suddenly found themselves prisoners of war. Similar scenes were beginning to unfold in Western Europe as the Allied advance gained momentum. As German positions collapsed, thousands more soldiers laid down their weapons. Handling such enormous numbers of prisoners created a serious problem. Britain, which had initially held many of the captured soldiers, simply did not have enough space or resources to house them all safely. The constant threat of German bombing raids made the situation even more complicated. The solution was unexpected but practical. The United States, far from the main battlefields and with vast land and infrastructure, agreed to take in large numbers of German prisoners of war. Soon, transport ships began crossing the Atlantic Ocean carrying an unusual cargo. Instead of troops heading to battle, these ships were filled with captured German soldiers guarded by Allied troops. Many of the prisoners had never imagined they would be sent to America. For them, the journey was long, uncertain, and filled with questions about what awaited them on the other side of the ocean. Some feared harsh treatment or prison camps, similar to those they had heard about in wartime propaganda. Others were simply exhausted, relieved to be far from the front lines, where death had become a daily reality. When the ships finally reached American ports, the prisoners were often surprised by what they saw. The harbors were busy but orderly, full of cranes, ships, and workers moving with quiet efficiency. Instead of ruins and bomb craters, there were intact cities and functioning infrastructure. For many of the prisoners, it was the first time they had seen a country completely untouched by the destruction of war. Streets were full of cars, factories were operating at full capacity, and life appeared strangely normal. From the ports, the prisoners were transported by train to camps scattered across the United States. One of the regions that would soon receive many of them was Michigan. At first glance, it seemed like an unlikely place connected to a global war. The state was known for its forests, lakes, farms, and most importantly, its powerful industrial centers. But in reality, Michigan was one of the beating hearts of America's wartime production. Factories across the state were producing enormous quantities of vehicles, engines, and military equipment that were being shipped overseas to support Allied armies. As the trains carrying the prisoners rolled through the American countryside, many of the German soldiers stared out the windows in silence. What they saw was difficult to ignore. Miles of farmland stretched to the horizon, dotted with tractors and machinery. Towns appeared prosperous and calm. There were no bombed buildings, no shortages visible from the railway tracks. For men who had spent years living under wartime rationing and constant air raid alarms, the contrast was striking. Eventually, the trains arrived at prisoner-of-war camps set up across Michigan. These camps were surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, but they were organized and structured in a way that many of the prisoners had not expected. Barracks were clean and orderly, food was distributed regularly, guards followed clear rules based on international agreements governing the treatment of prisoners of war. But what truly captured the attention of many prisoners was the industrial landscape nearby. Rising smokestacks, massive factory buildings, and the endless movement of trucks and trains revealed something important. Michigan was home to some of the largest manufacturing facilities in the world, including those connected to the powerful American automobile industry. During the war, many of these factories had shifted their focus from civilian vehicles to military production. For the German soldiers who had once believed in the unstoppable strength of their own nation's industry, the sight of this enormous production capacity was unsettling. They had heard rumors about America's industrial power before, but rumors were one thing, seeing it with their own eyes was something else entirely. Day and night, factory chimneys poured smoke into the sky. Freight trains carried raw materials in and finished equipment out. Workers moved with precision along assembly lines that seemed to stretch forever. The scale of it all was almost unimaginable. Some prisoners quietly exchanged glances, realizing that the country they were now in captivity within had resources far beyond anything they had expected. At that moment, for many of them, a quiet but powerful realization began to take shape. The war they had fought so fiercely might already be decided, not only on the battlefield, but in the factories, railroads, and industries of a nation's strength seemed almost limitless. And their arrival in Michigan was only the beginning of a story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the war, their enemy, and the future that awaited them once the guns finally fell silent. When the German prisoners arrived at their new camps in the United States, many of them expected the worst. Years of wartime propaganda had painted a terrifying picture of what captivity might look like. They had been told that the enemy would treat them brutally, that they would face starvation, harsh punishment, or even execution. For many of these men, the journey across the Atlantic had been filled with uncertainty and fear about what awaited them on American soil. But the reality they encountered was very different. Across the United States, the government had created an extensive and carefully organized system of prisoner-of-war camps. By 1944, more than 400,000 German prisoners were being held across the country. Camps were built in dozens of states, often located near farms, forests, or industrial areas where labor was needed. Michigan became one of the places where these camps quietly operated behind fences and guard towers. The camps themselves were usually made up of simple wooden barracks arranged in neat rows. Each building housed dozens of prisoners. Inside were bunk beds, small lockers for personal belongings, and basic heating systems to survive the cold winters. The buildings were not luxurious, but they were functional and clean. Every morning, the day began early. Prisoners lined up for roll call while American guards counted the men carefully. After that came breakfast, often consisting of bread, eggs, potatoes, coffee, or oatmeal. Many prisoners were surprised by the quantity and quality of the food. According to international agreements governing prisoners of war, captives were supposed to receive rations similar to those of the soldiers guarding them. In many cases, German prisoners in America actually ate better than civilians back home in Germany, where wartime shortages had become severe. The guards themselves were another surprise. Many of them were older soldiers or men who were not physically fit enough for combat duty overseas. Their job was to maintain order, prevent escapes, and ensure that camp rules were followed. Some were strict and distant, while others were surprisingly relaxed. Over time, a routine developed between guards and prisoners that resembled a strange kind of normal life. Days inside the camps were structured to keep prisoners busy. Idleness was considered dangerous, both for discipline and morale. Many prisoners were assigned to work programs. Some worked on nearby farms, helping harvest crops or repair equipment,
Others were sent to cut timber in forests or perform maintenance around the camps themselves. For American farmers, this labor became extremely important. With millions of American men serving overseas, the country faced serious labor shortages. Crops still needed to be planted and harvested, and farms could not operate without workers. German prisoners, under supervision, helped fill that gap. It was an unusual situation, enemy soldiers working in the fields of the nation they had once fought against. Despite the fences and armed guards, life inside the camps slowly developed its own rhythm. Prisoners organized sports games, played soccer, and sometimes built makeshift fields. Others spent time reading books provided by camp libraries or attending educational classes. Some camps even had small orchestras or theater groups formed by prisoners who had musical or artistic talents. Yet beneath the surface, tensions sometimes existed among the prisoners themselves. Not all German soldiers held the same beliefs. Some remained fiercely loyal to the Nazi regime, even in captivity. These men often tried to maintain strict discipline among fellow prisoners, enforcing loyalty to Germany and its leadership. Others, however, had grown tired of the war. After years of fighting, many simply wanted to survive and eventually return home to their families. In some camps, this division created quiet conflicts. Prisoners who spoke critically about the Nazi government sometimes faced threats or intimidation from hardline loyalists. American authorities became aware of these internal struggles and occasionally separated prisoners based on their political attitudes to prevent violence. At the same time, contact with the outside world slowly began to change how some prisoners saw the war. Working on farms or near towns gave them brief glimpses of everyday American life. They saw well-stocked stores, busy roads, and communities that seemed far removed from the devastation of Europe. Local civilians sometimes watched the prisoners with curiosity. Farmers who supervised work crews occasionally spoke with them, exchanging simple conversations in broken English or German. Some Americans were suspicious or angry, remembering that these men had once been part of the enemy army. Others, however, viewed them simply as young soldiers caught in the chaos of a global conflict. For the prisoners, these encounters were often confusing. The Americans they had been taught to hate did not always behave like enemies. Many treated them firmly but fairly. This experience slowly chipped away at the image of the United States that German propaganda had created during the war. Inside the camps, letters from home became some of the most important moments in a prisoner's life. Mail arrived occasionally through international channels, bringing news from families in Germany. Sometimes the letters spoke of destroyed cities, food shortages, or loved ones missing in the fighting. Each letter reminded the prisoners how far away they were from the war that still raged across Europe. As months passed, many prisoners began to realize that their lives inside these camps might continue for a long time. The war was not over yet, but the world they had once known was changing rapidly. And outside the fences, beyond the quiet routine of camp life, something even more powerful was waiting to confront them: the enormous industrial strength of the country holding them captive. Soon, some of these prisoners would be taken beyond the camp gates and brought face to face with one of the greatest symbols of American wartime power: the massive factories that were producing the machines of war at a scale few of them had ever imagined.
For many of the German prisoners held in camps across Michigan, life followed a predictable routine. Days passed with roll calls, work assignments, and the quiet rhythm of camp life. Yet rumors began to spread among the prisoners that some of them would soon be taken outside the camps for a different kind of work. At first, the idea sounded ordinary. Prisoners had already been working on farms and in forests, but this assignment would be something entirely different. One morning, groups of prisoners were assembled and placed onto guarded trucks and buses. The vehicles left the camps and began traveling along roads that led toward one of the most powerful centers of American industry. As the convoy moved closer to the outskirts of the city, the landscape began to change. Small towns and farmlands slowly gave way to a massive network of factories, rail yards, warehouses, and smokestacks stretching across the horizon. The prisoners stared through the windows, watching the scale of the industrial complex grow larger with every mile. Many of them had worked in factories back in Germany, but what they were now seeing seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Enormous buildings covered vast areas of land, their walls made of steel and concrete, their roofs stretching for what felt like endless distances. Soon the vehicles approached the massive facilities connected to the American automobile industry, including those operated by the powerful Ford Motor Company. Before the war, these factories had produced cars for civilians, but once the United States entered the war, everything changed. Assembly lines that once built family automobiles had been transformed into production lines for tanks, military trucks, aircraft engines, and countless other machines needed for the war effort. When the prisoners stepped out of the trucks, the noise alone was overwhelming. The air vibrated with the constant sound of machinery, metal striking metal, engines roaring to life, conveyor belts moving endlessly forward. Workers in uniforms and protective gear moved quickly across factory floors, guiding parts and tools with practiced precision. Inside the factories, production lines stretched across enormous halls, filled with bright lights and heavy equipment. Raw materials entered at one end of the building and moved step by step through the process until they emerged as finished machines, ready for transport to the front lines. Steel plates were cut and shaped. Engines were assembled piece by piece. Vehicles rolled slowly down the line as workers added components in a carefully timed sequence. The scale of production was unlike anything many of the prisoners had ever imagined. In Germany, factories had been working hard to support the war, but they were constantly under pressure from Allied bombing raids, shortages of materials, and transportation disruptions. Entire industrial districts had been destroyed by air attacks. Supply lines were strained, and production often slowed by the chaos of war. But here in Michigan, the factories operated in a world untouched by bombing. The buildings stood intact. Railroads carried endless shipments of steel, rubber, and fuel directly to the plants. Thousands of workers filled the halls, and the assembly lines rarely stopped moving. Some prisoners watched silently as rows of military trucks rolled off the line, one after another. Others saw engines being prepared for aircraft that would soon fly across Europe. Every few minutes, another completed vehicle emerged from the production line, ready to be shipped overseas. The realization began to sink in slowly. For years, many of these soldiers had believed the message repeated again and again by Nazi propaganda that Germany possessed the strongest industry in the world, that its technology and discipline would guarantee victory. But standing inside these enormous factories, that belief became much harder to hold. The numbers alone were staggering. American industry was producing tanks, trucks, airplanes, and weapons at a pace that seemed almost impossible to match. Entire fleets of vehicles could be built in the time it might take other countries to produce only a handful. One prisoner later described the moment as deeply unsettling. Watching the endless flow of machines coming off the assembly lines made him realize that the war was not only being fought with soldiers and weapons on the battlefield, it was also being fought with factories, workers, and resources on a scale far beyond anything he had previously understood. Even the workers themselves seemed confident and focused. Men and women moved efficiently along the lines, performing tasks that had been perfected through years of industrial experience. Many had been building automobiles long before the war began, and they had simply adapted their skills to wartime production. For the prisoners, it was a powerful and sometimes shocking experience.
They were no longer looking at enemy soldiers across a battlefield. Instead, they were witnessing the immense economic and industrial strength that stood behind those armies. Some prisoners exchanged quiet glances as they watched the machines being assembled. Without saying much, many were beginning to reach the same conclusion. Germany, despite all its efforts, was facing an opponent with resources that seemed almost limitless. The factories of Michigan represented only one part of a much larger system spread across the United States. Shipyards on the coasts, aircraft plants in other states, steel mills, oil refineries, and transportation networks all working together to feed the Allied war effort. For soldiers who had once believed victory was inevitable, this new perspective was difficult to ignore. Standing inside those roaring industrial halls, surrounded by the constant movement of machines and workers, some of them quietly understood something that had not been clear on the battlefield. The outcome of the war might already be decided. And yet, their story inside America was far from over, because working inside the enemy's powerful industrial system would bring new experiences, unexpected encounters, and conflicts that none of them could have predicted.
After witnessing the overwhelming scale of American industry, many German prisoners returned to their camps with a new and uneasy understanding of the war. The factories they had seen were not just large buildings filled with machines. They were symbols of a system capable of producing weapons, vehicles, and supplies in staggering numbers. For soldiers who had once believed Germany's victory was inevitable, the experience left a lasting impression. But the war continued, and life for the prisoners inside the United States moved forward. The American government expanded its prisoner labor programs, carefully organized under international agreements that allowed POWs to work under certain conditions. The goal was practical. With millions of American men fighting overseas, farms, factories, and local industries needed workers. Prisoners of war became an unexpected part of that workforce. Many German prisoners were assigned to agricultural labor across Michigan and other states. Early in the morning, trucks would arrive at the camps to collect work crews. Guards accompanied them as they traveled to nearby farms where crops needed harvesting, fences needed repair, or equipment required maintenance. Cornfields, orchards, and vegetable farms all depended on this additional labor. For the prisoners, the work was physically demanding, but often less dangerous than the battlefields they had left behind. Long days were spent under the open sky, cutting crops or loading produce into wagons. Some prisoners had grown up in rural areas of Germany and were already familiar with farming work. Others had never set foot on a farm before the war and had to learn quickly. American farmers watched the situation with mixed feelings. At first, some were uncomfortable relying on the labor of former enemy soldiers. The war was still being fought overseas, and many families had sons or brothers serving in uniform. Yet the reality of labor shortages forced many farmers to accept the arrangement. Over time, something unexpected began to happen. As prisoners and farmers worked side by side day after day, small conversations slowly replaced the initial silence. Communication was often simple, sometimes limited to gestures, basic English, or a few German words picked up along the way. But even brief exchanges began to reveal something important. Most of the prisoners were young men not so different from the Americans supervising them. Some farmers discovered that the prisoners were skilled mechanics, carpenters, or technicians who could repair machinery around the farm. Others noticed that many of them worked hard and followed instructions carefully. Gradually, in some places, suspicion began to soften into cautious cooperation. However, life among the prisoners themselves was not always peaceful. Inside the camps, deep divisions still existed. Some prisoners remained fiercely loyal to the Nazi regime, Even though they were thousands of miles away from Germany, they continued to believe in the ideology they had been taught. These men sometimes tried to enforce strict discipline among fellow prisoners, organizing secret groups and attempting to control behavior within the barracks. Other prisoners, however, had started to question everything they had believed. After witnessing the industrial power of the United States and experiencing life inside American camps, many began to doubt the messages they had heard for years through propaganda. They were tired of war, tired of fighting, and simply hoped to survive long enough to return home. This clash of beliefs occasionally created tension inside the camps. Prisoners who openly criticized the Nazi leadership sometimes faced threats from hardline supporters. In certain camps, fights broke out between groups with opposing views. American camp authorities monitored the situation closely and, when necessary, separated prisoners based on their political attitudes to prevent violence. Outside the fences, meanwhile, the prisoners continued to encounter ordinary Americans who challenged their expectations about the enemy. Local townspeople sometimes saw the prisoners passing through while traveling to work assignments. In small communities, it was not unusual for residents to watch quietly as guarded work crews moved through the streets. Some people looked at them with anger or distrust. Others simply felt curiosity. Occasionally, farmers allowed the prisoners to sit at the same table during lunch breaks in the fields. Meals were still supervised by guards, but the shared moments created rare opportunities for conversation. Prisoners heard stories about American families, farms, and daily life far removed from the violence of the war. For some prisoners, these experiences slowly began to reshape their understanding of the world beyond Germany. The Americans they encountered did not always match the image of ruthless enemies described in wartime propaganda. Many behaved firmly but fairly, following rules and treating prisoners as human beings rather than objects of hatred. Of course, the reality of captivity never disappeared. The fences, guard towers, and constant supervision were reminders that these men were still prisoners in a foreign land. Escape attempts did happen from time to time, although most were unsuccessful. The vast distances, unfamiliar language, and difficulty blending into American society made escape extremely difficult. Despite these limitations, daily life developed a strange balance between captivity and routine. Prisoners worked, returned to their camps, played sports, wrote letters home, and waited for news about the war. Some days felt almost ordinary. Other days were filled with anxiety as rumors spread about battles raging across Europe. Each new report carried the possibility that the war was nearing its end. For many prisoners, the greatest question remained unanswered. What would happen to them when the fighting finally stopped? Would they be sent home immediately, or would their captivity continue? Would the Germany they returned to even resemble the country they had left behind? As 1944 slowly moved toward its final months, the answer to those questions was getting closer. The war that had shaped their lives was approaching its final and most dramatic chapter. And soon, the prisoners in the camps across America would hear the news that would change everything.
By early 1945, the mood inside many prisoner of war camps across the United States had begun to change. For months, rumors about the progress of the war had circulated quietly among the prisoners. News traveled slowly, often arriving through official announcements, letters from home, or fragments of conversation overheard from guards and newspapers. But even with limited information, many prisoners could sense that the conflict, which had once seemed endless, was approaching its final stage. Across Europe, the situation for Germany was rapidly collapsing. Allied forces were advancing from the west, capturing cities and crossing rivers that had once been considered strong defensive barriers. At the same time, the Soviet army continued pushing from the east, moving closer and closer to Berlin.
Entire German units were surrendering as supply lines broke down and resistance became increasingly difficult. Inside the camps in Michigan and across the United States, prisoners gathered in small groups to discuss what these developments might mean for their future. Some still hoped that Germany might somehow recover and negotiate a favorable end to the war. Others, especially those who had already witnessed the enormous industrial strength of America, quietly believed that defeat had become unavoidable. Then, in the spring of 1945, the moment finally arrived. The news spread quickly through the camps. Germany had surrendered. At first, many prisoners struggled to process what they were hearing. For years, they had lived under a system that promised victory and national greatness. Even as the war turned against Germany, propaganda had continued to insist that success was still possible. Now, suddenly, everything was over. Reactions among the prisoners were mixed and sometimes emotional. Some men felt deep disappointment and humiliation. They had lost not only the war, but also the beliefs and ideals they had once defended. Others reacted with quiet relief. For them, the fighting was finally finished, and the constant fear of death on the battlefield had ended. American guards closely monitored the camps during those first days after the announcement. Authorities wanted to prevent unrest or conflict between prisoners who might react differently to the news. But in most camps, the transition was calmer than many had expected. The long months of captivity had already prepared many prisoners for the reality that Germany's defeat was coming. Yet surrender did not mean immediate freedom. Although the war in Europe had ended, the process of repatriating hundreds of thousands of prisoners would take time. The United States and its allies needed to organize transportation, ensure security, and decide how former soldiers would return to a defeated and devastated Germany. During this waiting period, American authorities began introducing programs designed to reshape the prisoners' understanding of the world they would soon return to. These efforts were often referred to as re-education programs. Their purpose was to expose prisoners to ideas about democracy, political freedom, and the realities of what had happened during the war. Some prisoners attended lectures or discussions led by instructors who explained how governments based on democratic principles functioned. Others were given access to newspapers, books, and films that described the destruction caused by the war and the crimes committed under the Nazi regime. For many prisoners, these programs were difficult to accept at first. Years of propaganda had created a powerful belief system that was not easily replaced. But slowly, exposure to new information and the experiences they had already had in America began to influence how some prisoners thought about their country and its future. Meanwhile, daily life in the camps continued much as it had before. Prisoners still worked on farms or in local industries where their labor was needed. They still played sports, wrote letters home, and waited for official orders about when they would finally return to Europe. Eventually, transportation plans began to take shape. Groups of prisoners were organized and sent to ports where ships waited to carry them back across the Atlantic. The journey home was filled with uncertainty. Many prisoners did not know what they would find when they arrived in Germany. Cities had been destroyed by bombing, governments had collapsed, and millions of people were displaced. Some prisoners would return to families struggling to rebuild their lives in a shattered country. Others would discover that their homes no longer existed or that loved ones had been lost during the war. Yet for a small number of former German prisoners, their experiences in the United States left a lasting impression that would influence the rest of their lives. Years after the war ended, some of these former German POWs made a surprising decision. Instead of remaining in Europe, they applied to immigrate to the United States. The country where they had once lived behind barbed wire had become a place they remembered differently than they had expected. They had seen its farms, its industries, and its communities during a time of global conflict. For them, America was no longer just the enemy from wartime propaganda. It had become a place associated with opportunity, stability, and a chance to start again. Over time, historians began to look back at the story of German prisoners of war in the United States as one of the more unusual chapters of the Second World War. More than 400,000 German soldiers had lived inside American camps during the conflict. Most of them had been treated according to international conventions, given food, shelter, and the chance to work rather than remain idle. And for many of those men, their time in America revealed something that went far beyond the experience of captivity. They had seen a nation's industrial power, economic strength, and political system play a decisive role in shaping the outcome of the war. Long before Germany officially surrendered, some of them had already sensed the truth while standing inside the roaring factories of places like Michigan. The war had been fought with tanks, airplanes, and soldiers across battlefields around the world. But in many ways, it had also been decided in the factories, railroads, and industries of a country capable of producing the tools of victory on a scale the world had never seen before.